Hey everyone, today I wanted to look at ICRPG Core 2nd Edition and ICRPG Master Edition side by side next to each other. And the reason for this is because these are both very active games. A lot of tables are either using Core or using Master Edition or a mixture of both, because what's so wonderful about it is that just because Master Edition came out didn't invalidate anything that was in Core, and these can be intermixed, and you can kind of mix and match the elements that were in the 2nd Edition and the Master Edition together to make the game that you want. All Master Edition is kind of a refined opus version of what ICRPG had to offer. Additionally, it compiled together a lot of the books into one tome, whereas Core is just one book of several. For example, in Master Edition, you have the Core book, the Core GM guide, the player's guide, a little bit of basic settings for the fantasy and sci-fi settings, Alfheim and Warp Shell, along with the Magic supplement, the World supplement, the Vigilante City superhero supplement, and the Blood and Snow supplement, which is the Ice Age kind of prehistoric setting, whereas Core is just the core rules. I wanted to look at them at a high level. I'm not going to go through every single page because there's several hundred pages to flip through, but hopefully this will help you see the differences, what's available for both. If you're new to the ICRPG scene and you're thinking about what to get, I highly recommend that you pick up Master Edition. You're going to get more of kind of the whole Runeverse with this one tome rather than Core, although eventually I would still recommend grabbing Core because it's just plain awesome. Both are great and you can use them interchangeably. So let's start with Core, the one that came first. So let's set aside Master Edition for a second and we'll open the Core paperback. And I got this one from DriveThruRPG, and so we can start just flipping through the pages. And what I think is really fun is if you're ever wondering about a book, you can just look at the contents or the table of contents and you can immediately start to see what's available here. So Core has the introductions, how to play, building characters, basic world primers, not full details, game mastery, which is one of the best game mastery, if not the best I've ever seen, the monsters, the adventures, some sample adventures, as well as tables, glossary, and some of the character sheets. So you can just start flipping through this and you still get your introduction about what ICRPG is, kind of how to use it, getting started, print and play, the bits and bobs of ICRPG, and straight into how to play. And so it's your turn to play, and so you get your describe roll results, which is essentially in these three images I love because it essentially just boils down RPGs to its very essence. You describe what you want to do, you roll for it, and you watch the results. Talking about movement and actions, we got the target and effort, types of checks as well, types of attempts, which is talking about effort. We start seeing distances and movement. This is kind of where we're starting to introduce into the banana method, which is fantastic. Just boiling down distances into rough estimates rather than hard, fast rules of feet and inches. Talking about time, which ICRPG uses turns, and so sometimes you want to talk about like, okay, a turn is a moment or an hour or a day, as well as how you can start scoring loot, so things like milestone rewards, looting fallen foes, getting gifts, what chests are, kind of how they can be used to grant loot, different loot types, food, gear, spells, and powers, the different death and dying. For example, in Core, it's a D6 rounds. You roll a D6 when you're dying before you're dead. With that dying timer, and then talks about recovery, how you can recover in certain times, rolling con in days and moments and hours, things like that. We jump into characters, and then we start talking about how to build a character. And so this is one thing that I wanted to point out and I know I'm zoomed out here, and so I'm just flipping between pages, so I'm not going to get straight into the details here. But for example, in Core, when you're allotting stats, there are 6 stats to allot: strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, and armor. And then you have your efforts, which are just basic, weapon, magic, and ultimate. So you'll notice that there's still armor in this one, which got turned into defense with Master Edition, as well as we're missing gun effort here. And then what happens as well is you get 6 points, so 6 points to allot between all of those things here in core, so you can allot anywhere between those 6 stats and armor, as well as your effort, so you split them out, whereas in Master Edition you get 6 points just for your stats, and then you get 4 points just for your effort. So now you're working with 10 points instead of 6, and then armor isn't a stat that you kind of dump points into, you rather apply your con bonus to it. And we'll get more into that when we look at Master Edition. Start talking about your starting loot that you choose from. They're not associated directly with your character type. You get your universal starting equipment, your weapons. You can see that it starts adding in ancient weapons, high-tech weapons. When you're reading the listings, you'll also start seeing tags, which are just little keywords that can grant mechanical bonuses, or they can just be flavor text, flavor bonuses, or flavor things to kind of think about these weapons and making them slightly different. For example, a great sword is near, it's huge, it's chopping, and it's heavy. So perhaps, you know, swinging a great sword is slower because it's heavy and it takes a certain amount of strength, or versus like a short sword, which is fast, light, and sturdy. So in flavor or narrative, these tags may or may not have a mechanical bonus to them or a mechanical effect, but they can impact how you think about the weapon as you build the narrative out with your GM or with your players. And it goes into more detail about these tags, giving suggestions on if you did want to provide mechanics to each of these tags. It gives suggestions. So for example, we were talking about heavy. It's awful on high gravity worlds and can cause fatigue on a journey. How that plays in, what mechanics you want to use, that's up to you, but that one simple word can imply a whole lot of meaning, and that's the power of tags. So more about loot, finishing out your character as well, giving some examples. And then we start talking about the classes. These are the Alfheim classes, and what these do are, again, you have things like Guardians, Blades, Shadows, Archers, and it gives recommended gear, so it suggests a kind of a loadout, because in core it really dives deeper into loot, and so it suggests different things, as well as it provides a starter reward, so a starter piece of armor, not armor, but loot, that kind of grants a bonus specific to the type that you're going after, as well as a list of milestone rewards that you can potentially get to. Many of them are still loot. There's a lot of focus on loot with these classes compared to Master Edition, which dives a little bit more into abilities, touches on them a little bit more, but they're still great because they still provide a lot of different options and things like that. So Priest, Scout, Commander, some of these classes ended up disappearing or going away, weren't included in Master Edition, but that does not mean you can't use them. So for example, if somebody came to my table and wanted to play a Commander that's not necessarily in Master Edition, we can still totally make it work. Wildling as well is another one. Different bioforms. So we have elves, dwarves, and humans in Master Edition, but in core there's also small folks and hill folks. They're still there, they're just not listed out, and so I would still totally allow these bioforms in my games. Then we dive into the Warp Shell classes, and the same things as well for the sci-fi. You'll see that there are certain classes that were here that aren't in Master Edition. We've still got bioforms that are here that aren't there, so things like the Psyker, and stuff like that. And then we have our Wiz powers and our Ints powers, diving into what they are, the wonders of wisdom using your Wiz, things like that, and the intelligence. And that can be a whole conversation to what's the difference, and that's mostly comes down to kind of academic versus the scholarly approach versus kind of the feeling approach to it, the connection to the natural world and all that stuff, as well as some spellcaster options to add a little bit different depths. Dive into the trials, and essentially right there, that's our kind of get started section to playing the game. So from there, you can really get a feel for how to create a character, get rolling, all the rules all nicely packed up in the first 50 pages. We got our world primer. I'm going to go a lot faster because there's a lot more to go through. So we got our Alfheim world primer, which includes many seeds here. and it goes even deeper in worlds, and I love worlds for that section, for that reason. And so you can still see some class quests. So depending on your class, it can perhaps say, oh, this is your class. Here's a very specific quest that you could go on that gives you a piece of loot reward that really dives into your class as well. Same thing for warp shell primers, suggestions, seeds, adventures, all that kind of thing that you can dive into. And then we get into the game mastery section, which is also in Master Edition. And this is, again, one of the best, if not the best, game mastering section I've ever seen in any RPG book. And so it talks about not only how to play ICRPG, but also just the mentality of ICRPG, the mindset that you're looking for, the idea of taking your oath as a GM, taking the session one by one, not planning out the whole campaign, thinking about the narrative technique, the mechanical techniques, working through location goals and obstacles, session by session, how to use easy and hard, how to escalate your target, how to end the session well, turn order, using those hearts. It really dives into many of the best principles to running a tight game of not only ICRPG, but any RPG, and it can be mix and match. How to have danger, energy, and wonder, how to challenge tuning, how to include timers, threats, and treats. It's, if you haven't read this, like, this should be immediately your number one to read list. Encounter archetypes, kind of ideas there. Even has playing with cards instead of dice. And you have your monster section, and so this is another big thing that you'll see difference from Core and Master Edition. It was a monster was a whole page, and it's a lot, but a thing that you actually don't end up using many of the stuff in here. Like, they really trimmed it down. Hank really trimmed it down for Master Edition. But it also, what I love about the core monsters is it gives so much extra flavor bits to it. So much, it gave you a better feel of it while still keeping it to one single page. And so it goes through each one talking about their powers, their actions, kind of details about them, and ways that you can really think about including them in your game than just a blanket stat block. And so there's quite a few monsters in here, and some of the actions and some of the stats change between the two. But again, I would happily throw in a monster from Core into my game than just what's in Master Edition as well. And then it talks about making monsters, which is fantastic. I did a little bit of a stream on that one a few weeks ago. And then we talk about adventures. Master Edition did not come with any preset adventures. They are available elsewhere in their own kind of little adventure booklet. But they included some adventures in the different worlds. So sci-fi, the fantasy, some different settings, even horror one. It gives a really good example of what a tight adventure could look like, or at least a session could look like. And I know ICRPG can sometimes come across as something that works really well for one-shots and not so much for long-running campaigns. The thing is I completely disagree with that. You can run long-form campaigns with ICRPG. It's just understanding how the progression works, how each session is its own thing, and these adventures really highlight what does a session look like, what can it be like, and then you're just repeating that for a long period of time. And you have the classic legendary Last Flight of the Red Swords. You have the other legend of in fantasy, which is Doom Vault. So between those two are probably the most legendary adventures that I feel is like a rite of passage for anybody who's into ICRPG to at least play and then to run, because they just cover so much of what's at the core of ICRPG together. Then you have Speeds Kills, which gets into some more details, things like chunks, things like movement, racing, things like that, vehicles, dives into more. Then you've got the Eyes of Set, which I like because it includes things, a lot more traps, it includes a lot more of that dungeony feel in a different way than Doom Vault. Big bad boss, monsters, things like that, different ways that the adventure could end. We have Beneath the Door, which is a touch on cosmic horror. It touches on some things that are a little bit more modern, maybe a little bit more pulpy. So for example, it gives a set of different classes that you could play. And I've used these before if I ever wanted to do kind of like a pulpy adventure, like if I was playing Temple of the Monkey God, Indiana Jones style. You could play with these, these different loot items as replacements. Touches on kind of how horror can work for the different monsters. We have the Fall of Arnor, which is kind of a two-part adventure using chunks, space warfare, getting into mechs and bodysuits, power suits, sorry. Different ways that you can build that one into, and then it goes into part 2, which is more out in space with space combat, how that can work, fighting with spaces and chunks, as well as you've got the classic amazing tables. And it's not just loot and things, it's things like the location, obstacles, and goals, hero creation, monster making, loot making, and these are great seeds for any adventure. Just roll a die and you've got the starting of heroes, of locations, of challenges, of quotes, things that could spur you to a whole campaign from one single line. And that's for monsters, for heroes, and then you've got your loot tables, ancient loot, shabby loot, cursed loot, sci-fi loot, epic loot, bizarre loot, and then finally some glossary of some key terminology from ICRPG, as well as variations of character sheets. Some of these were created by Hank, some of these were created by the community members, which I think is awesome that they were included. And finally, the back of the book. So 15 minutes to flip through ICRPG Core, but again, I hope you can see how much is just packed into the core of ICRPG, at least this second edition. And so it's a wonderful tome, and it's where I got my start on ICRPG, and that leads us into the newer edition, Master Edition, which is the refinement of what we see in Core. It's not rewritten, it's not redone, it's not redoing and coming out and getting rid of what's available here. It's just building upon into a more final form rather than replacing. So this is the collector's edition. This is from Modifius. Limited run. It includes kind of that faux leather thing, embossed cover, just really nice and tight, with especially the little cords for bookmarks. And so you dive right in. We've got an updated Doom Vault map there. You've got the Oath, and we start flipping through. And again, you can see. Let's see, you can start seeing how much extra bits are included in the table of contents of Master Edition. You've got the introduction, core, player's guide, GM's guide, all 5 main worlds: Alfheim, Worpshell, Ghost Mountain, Vigilante City, Blood and Snow, Monsters, the Magic Book, all the tables, and then your character sheets. And so you can, this is where Master Edition has packed in so much of what's available. And so you dive into what ICRPG is, how to use the book, and this is, again, I think the clincher to it, how to use the ICRPG rules. Short answer: don't. Index card RPG is a way of thinking. It's really calling out that ICRPG is a mindset. It's a way to empower you as a GM, empower you as a player to get to what you want to play, rather than be beholden to any particular rule set or system. Even ICRPG, it does not hold you to itself. It says, be the best GM player that you can be, and take these and run with them. So again, we see the classic boiling down of ICRPG in simple art, which is amazing. If anybody ever asks what's ICRPG or what's RPGs in general, it's this. It's really what it is. So we're getting through the core system. We still have many of the same things: types of turns, types of actions, the target, hearts and effort. We see that gun effort has now been included as the D8. Magic got bumped up. Ultimate is still at 12. Hearts and efforts are there. We're still seeing movement and distance. We're not seeing the banana method here, but you can still use it, and I still do highly recommend it. Time has been more of a turnaround and freeform approach. Then you're dying, you're recovering. This time it's rolling a d4 instead of a d6, how to heal, taking out some of the other trials and updating them to the Grey Hill Inferno. We're talking about the hero coin, and those are the core rules in 20 pages. And then we start talking about the player's guide, talking about the updated sheet, the different way. And what really is nice about this, and part of what you saw with the refinement, was that we had 5 different worlds that all were kind of, they felt a little bit different or disparate from each other. Master Edition refined them out so that they could be used interchangeably. I mean, they all use the same sheet, they all use the same process, slightly different items and things like that, but they're all following similar patterns there, and they kind of set the framework. Now, one thing you'll see though is that even though they're used more interchangeably, there's still some things that weren't done for the GM. Like, they gave the framework in Alfheim and Warp Shell, but some of the stuff in Ghostmat and Vigilante City and Blood and Snow were left alone, because if you want to match the style of Alfheim or Warp Shell or what's listed in Master Edition, that's for you to do. It wasn't done for us. And so if you want to have a character type in Blood and Snow that matches Alfheim, there's some effort and DIY that needs to be done, and that was done kind of, I think, on purpose, to encourage us to embrace that DIY spirit, to make it our own. Then we dive into creating characters, and this is where we see that everybody gets 6 stat points for their core stats and then 4 stats for their effort. And so you become a little bit stronger as a character because you're using 10 hit points, 10 stat points to divvy out versus just 6. Kind of talks about mastery, how you can gain things from powers, augments, loot, the different things. This is one of my favorite pages. 6 things your characters know, highlighting the world elements of it and the things that are the fronts of the world that every character will know, and that can build into, they can build into more campaigns if you wanted to address some of the world, the larger world issues. Then they go into the life forms, and again, this is still simple bonuses with some background that fit into the world, so that way you can start imagining how your character fits in the world, saying that some of the things that were not included, so for example, Gerblin wasn't included in the core, but now they're here, or Small Folk wasn't included in this one, now they're over. They're still there. They're still there, they're still available. You just have to do a little heavy lifting on your side to fit with what you want. This is where we start seeing character types. We start seeing the new format, which I really enjoy. It's a nice framework, and it allows you to really see, how can I build this character? Well, give yourself some abilities, give yourself some loot, some milestones, mastery abilities, and lay out this, and you can have a very clear way of fitting in things. So you have new character types, you have your loot that's available for everybody, your int spells, Wiz spells, again diving into the primer for Warp Shell, same thing, the things your character knows, character types, the bioforms, life forms, and things from there. Then we dive, here's the character types, different ways that we can build in. Talking about the milestone paths, these are kind of advanced heroes, and I have a upcoming stream, I'm going to be talking about a little bit more about this, ways to advance your characters from the basic beginnings into new ways of developing and growing into that kind of higher level, quote unquote. Different methods of doing that, different ways to progress, and then we dive into the GM guide. So in 76 pages we get the core kind of how to play, and then we're talking to the GMs, and many of this stuff is still the same. It's the principles are absolute gold. The wording has kind of been refined, the layout's been refined, and all the principles still remain as one of the best I've ever seen. And I go back to this all the time. Different ways to plug in, different ways to design rooms, different ways that we can include the threats, the timers, the treats, the 3Ds, the encounter archetypes, the ways to think through things, using cards, using targets, a lot of stuff that was there in core, but then over playtesting and many hours of gaming between the whole community, they're started to see trends and ways that can be can talk about like target damage, the basic kind of set targets you should think about, examples of targets, timer damage, next level timers, talking about defense rolls, damaging defenses, chunks, a little bit more, the horror mode details, adventure building the index card way. So this is kind of where you can do one session at a time. Talks about the wizard lock. Then we get into our monsters. And again, you'll see I now have, instead of 1, 2 monsters, I now have 4. They've really been honed down to what you need to run them at the table. You miss out on some flavor, but it really highlights that in half a page, this is really what I need to run an Avenger. And it's true. All that other stuff was extra. And so it includes all the monsters from all the different worlds, magic, kind of worlds, core, sci-fi monsters, and all this stuff can be thrown into any of your campaigns, any of your sessions. Talks about how to create monsters, the tier method, monster making, different ways to get started there. Diving into Durathrax, the great mother of all evils, the biggest bad there is. And then we dive into the worlds section, which is again engines of the age. These are the facts that everybody knows, and this is the fantasy world that's available in ICRPG. It's great filled out, and it's made to be a entire little continent with so many seeds. Trust me, I've counted a lot of them. That you could run a campaign for years with all the stuff that's available in worlds, and every single one could be the spark for an entire session, for an entire campaign, for an entire year worth of gaming can come from one bullet. And that's the power of what has been done here, as well as it's a nice framework that if you ever did want to build your own world, you can use it kind of as a template to what's really necessary for kind of world building, rather than getting lost in the weeds with a lot of stuff that just doesn't end up getting used. And a lot of it focuses on actionable items for these areas, things that players can actually act on if they're interested in there, something that can pique an interest and say, I want to go play an adventure here. We see the map of Alfheim. And then the same thing with Warp Shell, talking about saving the universe. Classic way of jumping around the universe, getting something different every week, but also can have long-lasting approaches and campaigns with the universe, different kind of fronts to deal with, the Zil, the Zurin, the Reptoids, kind of the paradoxes, different planets, how to run things out in space with the whole universe is in the palm of your hands. And what's really nice is it doesn't take you, it's not about the scale, going to the large scale, it's about zooming in to just the crew and what they're experiencing from week to week. And that's how you can successfully kind of play this massive sci-fi world. We talk about, then it gets into Ghost Mountain, the third of the big five, the kind of the Weird West. This is the in-between space between heaven and hell. It's great lore building going on, getting that Western style approach to it, being cowboys and Meritos and gunners, and it's just so tasty to play with. And you can see here, so this is, again, this is the character type from Ghost Mountain, so it's much more reminiscent of what's in core, but with some effort you can turn this into something that's reminiscent of the character types that you see in Alfheim and Warp Shell. Same thing with starter equipments. You got some extra things like the guns, some gun rules, some supply rules, a few extra spells, as well as some things that are explicit for just the Ghost Mountain world, some monsters, some different dungeons, and then we dive into Vigilante City, and it just goes from one thing to the next. I'm talking a mile a minute here, but Vigilante City is our superhero. This is just taking everything up to 11, that kind of block by block battle, superpowers. If you ever want to play that, it's a great way of doing it without getting super complicated. Different equipment, using vigilante points, stun points, and things like that to use your powers. Great way of managing kind of that super energy that comes with superheroes, kind of limiting them, so there's still choices to be made, and they still feel powerful, but they also feel that there's a struggle, which is always important in superhero games. And then it keeps going through the different villains and how they're played. So this is another great way to play huge supervillains. We get into Blood and Snow, different worlds, very different feel to it. The exploration, kind of the survival, moving through that kind of exploring of what's going on back in the day with no magic available. Hunting and foraging is in there, and the relic, the snowfolk, things like that, talking about how you can do it using tags, rolling for your stories, your oath, your appearance, using your stat points to get more tags and abilities. And so again, what's really nice about all these different things is they're all the same system, but you can pull pieces from anywhere to build out the experience that you want. So like Blood and Snow has a more emphasis on tags or abilities and things like that versus Vigilante City, who doesn't, but that doesn't mean you can't pull that over into it if you really like it. Kind of a set campaign within Rural Blood and Snow. Then you talk about the updated magic section. This is probably one of the sections that got the biggest uplift. It was really kind of overhauled, to, not completely redone, but really refined a lot compared to the original magic. Both are still valid, both are still ways to do it, but yeah, you get a much cleaner approach that's more fitting, because the original magic book felt very different than what was done before, whereas this feels a lot closer to what you might find with the superpowers in Vigilante City. So it does tie them a little bit closer rather than feeling like its own completely separate system. Talking about different advanced mages, advanced characters, wizards and warlocks and things like that. Talking about different things like potions, fungi, using index card for your spells, towers, and building and sanctums, the different dimensions and realms of Alfheim and the Runeverse. The different spell listing, these advanced spells, the different types, arcane, holy, and infernal, listing out kind of how they build into one another, going through all the spells here, so it gives a lot more detail rather than in what you see in like the basic player's guide, which is just kind of a one-line approach to it. This has a little bit more detail, targets, duration, how they work, different power levels and different costs that you can incur as you build into all of them. And we're getting near the end. We get finally to our tables. Again, same thing, location, obstacles, and goals, which are great. Heroes, the essentials, divvying out to the monster selector, so a way to roll out what monster is going to appear, monster makers, and then your classic loot tables, all the way from shabby to bizarre, and finally to Ghost Mountain, and I believe it ends on magic loot and the character sheet. And that's the end of Master Edition. So again, flipping through both books side by side, ICRPG is just absolutely jam-packed with just about everything that you need to run any game, any type, any system of world or whatever you might need. There's elements for everything, and because this is a mindset and not only a rule set, you can start picking out just the things that you want, adjusting them, twisting them, combining them, altering them to DIY the game that you want it to be. I think that it's on its own, playing it rules as written, it's a perfectly valid, supremely satisfying system, but it also enables and grants you permission to make it your own. And so, side by side, core, Master Edition, that's where they are. Highly recommend that if you're still thinking about it, look into them. If you already have, look into them more, see elements that you've never picked up on, and just throw them into your game and see what happens.